Come down this road with me.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm so excited about the conversation. I don't get to do this very often, so thank you very much. I was going to ask you, given everything that we've having been an interviewer, I'm now doing your job and bringing it together, but not for the same reason. I want to get your opinion, your impression of how this works, but I want to bring this back to the currency audience, because I'm not sure that the only thing that unites most of us out there is the blessing that is supposed to be coming to us. And I'm not so sure that once that happens, that all bets aren't off. You know, everyone talks about, they're going to do this for humanity and that for humanity. And I'm talking to myself here too. I'm not excluding myself from the responsibility here. But I'm wondering about the community of individuals whose only uniting or unifying force has to do with a change in their capability to impact the world fiscally. And I don't know if they understand, as I think I do, that this is as much a damnation as it is a blessing. I don't know if they understand that. You know, now you got to give it up or tell where it is. You can't sit down and talk a whole bunch of mess anymore about if I were this and if I were that. Now you've got to sit down and you've got to really work until 2 or 3 in the morning sometime, because there's some resources that need to get out there, and you're the only one who can do it. Are you prepared to do that? I'm concerned about that, because if there isn't that kind of commitment within the community, with all the other negative crap that's going on out in the world that I live in, if you don't have that kind of focus and commitment, then it's just money and good stuff thrown away, and some people will, have a nice apartment to live in for a year, and then they'll be right back where they were. And I'm not interested in for me personally, I'm not interested in switching from a Chevy to a Ford. I'm interested in going to an electric car. I want to change the model. I want to change the paradigm, and most of us don't. I assume that most of us don't understand that that's not, number one, not as easy as it may sound, and number two, if it's not in your rearview mirror or in your headlamps going forward, then we're. I just worry. Excuse me for this. I'm a worrywart, and I'm just very concerned about where we go from here. What is it? What someone once said, my brother once said to me, it's not original, but he said the two ironies in life, one is not getting what you want, which is where we are right now, and the other is getting what you want. Now what? What do we do now?
Well, I'll tell you what. One, I'm going to relieve your worry from this standpoint.
Okay, cool.
There's not going to be a global currency reset. It's not going to happen. I work directly with the only human being on the planet who could make that happen. Okay. And I will tell you that the real plan was a global reset. And the global reset, you can actually go to the speakproject.net, and you can go to the I lose this every time, but on there we have the Singleton document. And the Singleton document is the document that every country in the world signed. And every country in the world signed off on this document under the scope of the United Nations. Now, when this was signed, there was a sole sovereign monarch on the planet. And this monarch was a military dictator. He's referred to in documents as the King of Kings, sometimes the Great Dictator. When it comes to the Federal Reserve, he's referred to as the Arbiter. Mm-hmm. And he would have the final say. So it didn't matter what the contract said, because if he deemed it something else, it was that. It didn't matter. Right? Now, that always has existed. So we always give all this homage to, the Rothschilds or the Pessoas, or, these dragon families, right? But the dragon families were much lower on the totem pole in reality.
Yes.
And at the top of the order was always this great dictator. Now, this great dictator, his job was to gather up and register all of the assets on the planet, which he accomplished in 2007. So everything on the planet, both in-ground assets, above ground assets, homes, buildings, everything was registered to the unknown country. Now, the unknown country is what is recognized in every single system, every single financial system, every single government system. It is the natural intelligence or the artificial intelligence that expands and maps everything on the planet. So the goal was to take the resources off planet, okay, and take possession of them, kind of like a cancer would, right? A cancer is supposed to die, right, through apoptosis. It doesn't die, so it can't create its own energy, so it devours things that are creating energy around it, right? Now, the draconian mentality was a cancer. And what they did was the draconian and the mantis would come in and they would devour the resources of a planet. They would kill off the race that was here or use them for whatever. And then they would essentially leave the planet, barren. And that was the goal, right? Now, in this, everyone below him was a slave. Everyone. Now, there was 154 people at the top or something about that. And then there was the families, right? Like the Dragon families, the Canadian 300, all those kind of things.
Yep.
And they were all slaves. They were all slaves. And their job was to gather the resources of the planet. Now, the problem you're having now is what they've always done is they would take possession of an asset. They would put it into the asset redemption program. And what it would do is it would register it, right? So now the asset redemption program, which was the unknown country, or the trust now, the Man of World Holding Trust. And they would register that asset, and then it would give them back paper currency, right? It would say, here's an allocation number for you to go print this currency, right? And this is what its value is. And so they would go out with useless paper that, the dictator had no value for, right? He didn't care about the paper, right? So they would go out and they would spend it and live their lavish lifestyles and hedonistic ways and whatever, right? So that is what's happened forever. Now, they became experts at using this system. Now, this was all based on a contract. Now, the contract was made between humanity, right? And this was after the Great Deluge and, the fall of Atlantis and all of the, this great nuclear war, right? Which there's all types of evidence in the Mediterranean Sea and things. This great war that really destroyed a bulk of the planet, and it flooded it, right? And there was really like a water moon that crashed into the planet, and there was additional water that came into the planet. And so that changed the landscape of the planet. And so what happened was, there was supposed to be like an integration of like the native tribes and like the Atlanteans was supposed to be like some kind of integration, right? And that ended up getting infiltrated by the Draconians, right? They came in and kind of took over Atlantis. So, and then they ended up waging war with the very peaceful Lemurians. So, and then this ended up being a time of great grief where humanity was completely grief-stricken. So the Draconians being, they set up the whole situation, right, with the Mantis, and the Mantis would control the technology, and the Draconians were great warriors, right? So they took over the planet in return for being allowed to declare global martial law. They would rebuild the planet. And now this is like a 16,500-year-old contract, right? Now, those same characters were still in charge in 2012. Now, that contract expired in 2012. And the planet, if they were not able to bring the entire planet under one world government or the New World Order, then they had to return it back to humanity. So in 2012, they identified a genetic anomaly that happens about every 2,000 years. The genetic anomaly, you can see it with, Eve. You can see it with Joshua, the son of Nun, with the Messiah, all these different characters who clearly had a greater scope of abilities to communicate with the spirit and to just really understand the natural biological technology that is ingrained in all of us. So in earlier than this, but in 2012 it was confirmed that Kimberly Ann Gogan was 99.8% bioidentical to the mitochondrian Eve. So in other words, she is 99.8% bioidentical to the 5 original tribes on the planet, okay? And she was identified as the most human, and because the contract was going from Draconian back to humans, in 2012, which I'm sure if you've been around the GCR at all, we all thought things were going to go in 2012, right? So everything was turned back over to humanity. So that was all, quantified and registered to the real quantum system, which is a quantum mapping system. It's not a quantum financial system. It's a quantum mapping system. And the quantum mapping system has the ability to literally entertain all possible realities at all times, just the way, when we talked about the split test, right? Or the, what do you call it, the Heisenberg?
Oh, that's the double slit test, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the principle, right, is that this quantum system is made by galactics that were also enslaved, and it's 1,000 years past any technology on the planet. And this device had already mapped all the assets, all the resources on the planet, and everything was registered to its ownership, right? So for humanity to take possession of this system means that humanity takes its rightful role as caretakers and guardians of the planet, right? Now, in that's what happened in 2012. Now, at that point, the Rothschilds and the Pacers and all these dragon families, they were given 5 years to return the assets of the planet back to the people. And they didn't even try. What they did instead was they took that as a 5-year extension to continue to try to implement their New World Order, right, in their one world government. So in those 5 years, that's why you have things like the global currency reset came to the surface, and everybody started to understand what it was. Now, the way the global currency reset was set up is that they were slowly diminishing the value of the U.S. dollar since 1958 or so. And they were bringing the value of the dollar down because in the 70s, they all agreed that there would be a peaceful transition of power from the Americans in the West, the black dragons in the West, to the dragon families in the East and China. And that's why everything in the GCR was about the benevolent Chinese, how wonderful the Chinese are, the Chinese own everything, the Chinese elders, nonstop. All of that was because they are just another one of these Rothschild families. They're the same group is what I mean. not that they're the Lees, the Gaos, but they all agreed that they were going to do this transition. So that's why from the 70s to now, you have a complete change in our perception of what it means to be American, what it means to be Chinese. They've implemented and expounded on the fat, lazy, dumbed down American, entitled American, right? And we don't understand the great ancient values of the Chinese. The Chinese have bought up Africa. They bought up land here. They've taken over parts of Canada. I mean, they've been taking over the world, right? Because in their contract, right, with each other, it was decided the Chinese would be the rulers for the next 100 years. Okay, so now we're witnessing that now. So part of this was the revaluation, which would have given the Chinese a decisive advantage because they would have got the highest possible rates and been able to revalue, and a few of us would have jumped in on that. Then they would have had the global currency reset, which is where everything would have gone to basically 1-to-1, right? Now, in doing that, what we thought was, well, everything's going to be asset-backed, and obviously we thought there was just a gazillion pounds of gold on the planet, which there's no possible scenario where that ever could be honored, ever, right? Because as soon as you do that, you would collapse the U.S. dollar, which is pegged to 146 countries, and it would immediately, overnight, it would collapse the world's economy. Okay? So what they had set up to transfer power to the Chinese in the East is they set up the structure. Now, you can see this in the Singleton report. They actually talk about it, right? That's where you get the ideas of universal income. So what they were going to do is instead of letting us thrive and let us be, all of us be wealthy and distribute the wealth ourselves, which is the lie they told us, okay, what they planned to do was to allow exchanges to take place. Now, some of these exchanges, if you remember, they would always be talking about the exchange centers, right? So I know people, I spoke directly and often to white hats who were guarding the exchange centers. But I also had Marines on the ground outside of certain places, and they identified certain things such as stacks and stacks of coffins, stacks and stacks of guillotines, right? Now, this goes back to the rapture, right? Now, the Christians were indoctrinated with this idea of the rapture. And in the rapture, they actually had movies out about the raptures back in the 70s where, everybody would be caught up who believed in Jesus, right? The true believers would be caught up, right? Now, the true believers who would be caught up, that was us, right? That was the currency holders nowadays, okay? And so they'd be caught up, and then the next step would be, there'd be 7 years of judgment. And everybody left behind would be forced to get a mark on the back of their hand or their forehead, and that would be what nowadays we would consider to be a microchip that they would put in the back of your hand or your forehead, and that would end up being your cashless society they're always talking about, right? So now we all get chipped, right? So now we're all chipped, and what they would do is in this movie they would have guillotines, and they would give people one last chance to conform, right, to be a slave basically to this United Nations system, this New World Order, and they'd lay them face up on the guillotine, right? Now the reason why I mentioned that in the movie is because in this day and age, why on earth would we have guillotines, right? Why would that even be available? Well, because it's just a very archaic way of killing people, right? Well,
yes.
And why would you need to kill people in mass quantities? Right? Why would you need to commit genocide? Well, the reason why is everything they predicted that they created, they have to bring to life. So they were executing their plan just the way they laid it out, right? Even with things like the keys of Enoch, right? That was a big thing because there is a real principle with the keys of Enoch, because Enoch in the Bible, he was translated into heaven in the body. So he ascended in the body. Now that's the key to everything, is for us to ascend while still being in a body, not just to die off and ascend, right? Because that's always what they wanted us to believe, that we would just die off. So if we got bullied and ruined, our life was terrible, it's okay because we go on to heaven, right? So all these principles are false doctrines that they put out everywhere, and then they have worked to make them come to life. So that's why now when people see galactics, they're so indoctrinated, they're like, they're all demons. No, they're not. They're not all demons, okay? But so these principles have been working now. So what I believe they were going to do, now this part is I've verified it from different sides, but I haven't seen this documentation. But what I believe they were going to do is the exchange centers were going to be FEMA camps where they were going to take us in, and I would have been like, hey, Mathew, I'm going to exchange, man. And you'd be like, all right, good luck, And then I'd go in, and they'd take me in and kill me or, put me in a cage or whatever, and I never exchange. And you'd think, because you didn't see me anymore, that I signed a non-disclosure agreement, right?
Yes.
And you wouldn't even question that I was missing. And they would have done this in mass quantities because the biggest threat was the awakened public. So they took the awakened public, right, the believers, the dreamers, the ideologists, right, the inventors, the authors, the artists. They took all of them, and they gave them the pipe dream of you can spend, $200 and be a millionaire, right, or a billionaire, right, and you can have this. And they told us all that so that we would all be stagnant, right? It's like from a science fiction book called The Foundation, right, where we would all be stagnant. So then what happened is all these people were making all this incredible progress, waking up, doing all these amazing things. And most people, I'd say 95% of them, stopped, and they waited for the money. And then, because they're all, not all of them, most people were pretty intelligent, they became experts in the narrative that they were telling them. So everybody became experts. So people became gurus and made a living at it and did all these different things and became experts in the currency. So everybody in the currency community can spit off all these different things that are only part of the story. See, they didn't get the whole story is the problem. So the part of the story they got, a currency revaluation, makes perfect sense. What they don't understand is that's not how the system actually works. That's only how it worked on the slave level. So now, that brings us current. So here's what their plan is even now, that the trustee and our whole team has been breaking up, is this. What they wanted to do is they wanted to have the currency revaluation so the banks all get liquid, right? Then instantaneously crash the U.S. dollar, thus transferring power to the East. In that, this would give opportunity to release all sorts of biological weapons. For anybody who doesn't believe that, you can go listen to the show I did earlier today with Michelle Walker, and she explains in great detail how there is, what does she call them? Designer biological weapons set to be latent in your body, infected upon us with vaccines and other ways too, right? Because it's putting smart dust in the air, that would be activated by a frequency causing biological warfare. And what would happen is you'd have this massive die-off of humans from these biological diseases. And it would become – so now imagine the scene, right? The economy collapses, right? And because the economy collapses, it's already chaos. So the United Nations has the authority in that situation, because you have a global disaster, to come in and take over every country's military. So now you don't have multiple militaries. You don't even have countries. You have the United Nations military. And they are in absolute global control of everything. And their military force is formidable, and it's everywhere. It's the NATO military, it's the UN military, and now it's the U.S. military, it's China's military, all of them on one page. And here's what they're now fighting, because they want to transition to a quote-unquote peaceful society. So to do that, they look at us as the enemy of the state. So here's the problem. Now in comes biological weapons. And you have a growing fear and concern of biological issues that are happening that they've already implanted in us, remember, with vaccines. And now they just send out a frequency that activates those viruses, and people start dying off in massive quantities. I spoke to people when this was about to go off 2 years ago, and they literally were setting them up to quarantine people up in Seattle, right? They were going to quarantine people and push them into stadiums. And one of these viruses that they have actively set in these nanites, this like microscopic technology, one of these viruses is the zombie virus, right? And they tested it down in Florida. That's why a couple of years ago you saw when these people suddenly started eating other people's faces, right? And it was like, what is going on? And what they would do is it would devour human flesh. And because the human flesh is being eaten, we would naturally crave human flesh. So people would literally become zombies eating each other, right? That's why you have shows out and movies out, and what they're doing is they show up in Seattle, you have this show called iZombie where the zombie virus breaks out. And they end up quarantining Seattle, and zombies live in peace and harmony with each other, right? You just have to make sure they have enough brains, right? And so what they're doing is they're actually promoting that when you would eat someone else's brains, you would get their thoughts, their emotions, their experiences, their skills, right? So that's what they're doing with all of the technology. They're having us constantly consume someone else's thoughts, right? All the time. So we're living in a virtual world already. So they would have these viruses break out. Now imagine you've got military guys, right? So the military guys are used to when you go into battle, you get a whole bunch of vaccines, you get shot up with all types of stuff, but they don't know what they are. But I can tell you that at least some of them, I know that Agent Orange was laced with LSD, right? Now, if you've ever tripped and you had LSD, then you know what you start to see is you start to see the ugly side of people. You start to see people the way Leonardo da Vinci drew them in his ugly portraits, right? So imagine there's LSD in them. Then they're going to give them a serum to make them like super soldiers, like superstar. Now, this exists. I know this for a fact as well. This is like what they gave Jason Bourne, right, which would make them super, like almost indestructible. So now you've got a whole group of soldiers that are loaded up on LSD, and they're super powerful. They're much stronger than the average person. And then you have people that are literally as far as the soldiers know, these guys are all infected with viruses that are contagious. So this would give them not just the right, but the responsibility to commit genocide on a massive scale, where they'd have to start quarantining people, blowing them up, bombing, massive shootings on a scale you couldn't even imagine, because we'd have to get rid of the disease, right? And the fight wouldn't be against the people. That's how they justify it. The fight would be against the disease. And at the same time, you have global, warming, right? It's a whole myth about global warming that they perpetuated on everyone. So at the same time, we've got to get rid of the overpopulation would happen. And what they would do is they would make it look like the environment itself had turned on humanity. And the way they do this is by dropping the smart dust from the sky. It infects everything. Then they activate a frequency which causes the environment to start to secrete radiation, causing massive death. But the plants themselves would be fine. And the animals would be fine. But the people would be suffering with radiation poisoning on a scale that would be the zombie apocalypse, literally, right? And while this is happening, this purge of most of humanity, It's written on the Georgia Guidestones. It says to bring the population to a manageable number of 500 million people. Now, that would be approximately 90% of the population. Now, remember, this all started with the global currency reset being the spark. And that's what put everybody into – and they got everybody with their guard down. They sparked all this off. Now, the power's transferred to the East. Now, the whole world's in an utter state of economic collapse. So what happens? The banks come in, and the banks say, look, you guys messed it up again, right? Because they love to shame us. You guys messed it up again, so we're going to give you cryptocurrency. We're going to make all the currency digital. Now, you've heard that, right? Cashless society, everything's digital, right? So then they're going to introduce universal income because all the money is useless. It's worth pennies, so nobody has any wealth. So just to cover now, and because we're all starving to death, right, and people are eating each other, to give us universal income, we're like, oh my God, thank you so much for the universal income. You know, thank you for the $18,000 a year so I can just barely survive, right? And so everybody gets the same pittance, and what does that do? That limits where you can go, what you can do, what you can see, what you're aware of, because your world becomes smaller, right? And now everybody left is a slave, and they tell you, listen, everybody's got to do their part. And the global regulatory authority on everything becomes the bankers, which are the very ones who enslaved us in the first place.
I had a question.
That was the plan.
No, that's very interesting, and thank you for that.